Incredible. Why winters in Victorian era London were brutal. Boring history for sleep. Hello there, and welcome. Imagine, if you will, stepping out of a time machine not into the swinging 60s or the roaring 20s, but smack into the heart of Victorian London midwinter. The first thing that hits you, even before the smell of coal smoke and unwashed humanity, is the cold. A raw, biting, seep into your bones kind of cold that your modern, centrally heated sensibilities are utterly unprepared for. You'd probably be a human icicle before you could say Charles Dickens. This isn't the picturesque, snow-dusted London of Christmas cards, not entirely anyway. This is a London in the grip of a winter that could be, and often was, truly brutal. You might think a woolly scarf and a stiff upper lip are all you'd need, but trust me, surviving a Victorian winter was an extreme sport, and you've just been entered into the Olympics without any training. I'm always curious where you all are listening from. So, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see our little community of history explorers tuning in from all corners of the globe, seeking a bit of respite from the here and now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a cobblestone street corner, the gas lamps flickering weakly, casting a pale, ghostly glow on the icy stones underfoot. It's late afternoon in, let's say, January 1862, and the light is already fading from a leaden sky. A dense, bone-chilling fog, thick as pea soup and twice as grimy, swirls around you, blurring the edges of the tall, soot-stained buildings and seeping into every crevice. It's a fog that doesn't just obscure your vision. It feels like it's trying to get into your lungs, your very soul. You pull your totally inadequate modern coat tighter, but it's like trying to stop a tidal wave with a tea towel. The air is thick with the smell of damp wool, wet coal, horse manure, and 1,000 other unfortunate things you'd rather not identify. Welcome to winter in the greatest city of the 19th century. Lucky you. Ahead of you, hunched figures scurry past, their faces buried in scarves, their breath pluming in the frigid air like tiny, desperate ghosts. The clip-clop of a horse drawing a hansom cab echoes mournfully, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive blanket of fog and falling snow. You quickly realize that your fashionable, thin-soled boots are about as useful on these treacherous, ice-slicked streets as a chocolate teapot. Every step is a gamble, a potential pratfall waiting to happen. You see a newspaper boy, no older than 10, his face blue with cold, hawking the evening paper, his voice hoarse. You wonder how he, or anyone, endures this day after day. The truth is, the Victorians were a hardier breed, partly because they were living through the chilly twilight of a centuries-long period of global cooling, known quite dramatically as the Little Ice Age. This wasn't some overnight cold snap. It was a climatic epoch that, broadly speaking, stretched from the 14th or 15th century well into the mid-19th century. Historians still discuss its precise start and end dates, and the cocktail of causes, perhaps a spate of volcanic eruptions dimming the sun or shifts in solar activity, but its effects were undeniable. Europe, and indeed London, experienced significantly harsher and snowier winters during this time. So, while you're shivering and thinking about complaining to the management, remember your Victorian counterparts were dealing with this as their normal. No wonder they looked so serious in all those old photographs. They were probably just trying to stop their teeth from chattering. This little ice age meant that things like the River Thames freezing solid, an almost mythical event for us, were far more common occurrences for them. In fact, one of the last truly epic freezes happened in the winter of 1813 to 1814, just before Victoria took the throne, when the Thames iced over for a full 2 months, leading to a spontaneous and raucous frost fair on its surface, site 468, 480. Imagine that. An impromptu carnival with ox roasts, puppet shows, and souvenir stalls, all set up on the frozen river. They even paraded an elephant across the ice site. 481, though what the elephant thought of this career diversion is, sadly lost to history. It's a bit like finding out they once held a music festival on a glacier. Charmingly bonkers. Even a regular Victorian winter, not one of the record breakers, was a formidable adversary. With no central heating as we know it, and insulation, Being more of a vague concept than a building standard, the cold didn't just knock at the door. It moved in, put its feet up, and made itself thoroughly at home. The primary source of warmth came from coal fires, thousands upon thousands of them, each belching smoke and soot into the already damp air. This, as you'll soon discover in more detail, was a recipe for a truly unique atmospheric horror. The cold seeped through thin tenement walls, whistled through ill-fitting window frames, and made every draft an icy dagger in the back. You begin to understand why layers were less a fashion statement and more a survival strategy. Forget breathable fabrics. They probably dreamed of being wrapped in a sentient quilt. The biting wind seems to find every gap in your clothing, and the damp chill from the cobblestones is already making its way up through your shoes. You're starting to think that maybe, just maybe, those heroic tales of Arctic explorers weren't so much about bravery as a desperate attempt to find somewhere that felt comparatively warm. As you stand there, still reeling from the initial shock of the cold, you become aware of another, even more insidious element of a Victorian London winter: the fog. This isn't the romantic misty veil you might imagine from old movies. Oh no. This is the infamous London pea souper, and it's less of a gentle mist and more of an atmospheric assault. It begins to creep in as the weak daylight surrenders, completely, not a rolling bank from the river, but seemingly coalescing out of the smoky air itself. One moment you can make out the vague outline of a building across the street. The next, it's gone, swallowed by a thick, greasy, yellowish-brown blanket that clings to everything. You take a breath and immediately regret it. The air tastes metallic and acrid, a vile cocktail of soot, sulfur, and 1,000 unidentifiable industrial effluvia, all mixed with the damp chill of the river. It stings your eyes, making them water, and you feel a tickle in your throat that quickly escalates into a cough. This, you realize, is what Londoners breathed. It's a wonder anyone had any lung capacity left. They were probably all breathing in shifts. The fog doesn't just hang in the air. It has a palpable, almost oily texture, leaving a grimy residue on your skin and clothes. You can practically feel it trying to get into your pores. Your modern sensibilities scream for an N95 mask, or perhaps a full hazmat suit. These notorious fogs, a feature of London life throughout the Victorian period and well into the 20th century, Site 473, were a direct result of the city's love affair with coal, combined with its unfortunate geography. London sits in a low-lying basin, prone to natural river mists, especially in the colder months. Add to that the smoke pouring from hundreds of thousands of domestic hearths and factory chimneys, all burning cheap, sulfurous coal, and you have the perfect recipe for these atmospheric monstrosities. As temperatures dropped, particularly during winter inversions, this noxious brew would get trapped close to the ground, creating a smog bank that could envelop the city for days, sometimes even weeks at a time. Historians still debate the exact chemical composition and the primary culprits. Whether domestic fires or burgeoning industry contributed more to their legendary thickness. But for you, standing in the middle of one, the academic distinctions feel rather moot. It's just awful. Navigating through this is a nightmare. Street names become invisible. Landmarks vanish. You try to walk a straight line but quickly become disoriented, bumping into other shadowy figures who loom suddenly out of the murk, equally lost. It's like being trapped inside a giant, poorly lit, badly ventilated chimney. The usual cacophony of the city is strangely muffled, sounds distorted and eerie. A newsboy's cry seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The rumble of an omnibus is a vague threat that could materialize inches from your face without warning. You hear stories of link boys, youngsters who, for a small fee, would guide people through the densest fogs with flaming torches, though you suspect their main skill was not getting lost themselves, which in this seems like a superpower. The danger is very real. Pedestrians regularly stumbled into the Thames, mistaking the riverbank for the road in the disorienting gloom. Carriages and omnibuses veered off course, leading to collisions and injuries. Crime flourished in the anonymity the fog provided. Pickpockets and worse could melt away into the soup before a victim even realized they'd been targeted. It's said that even the cattle being driven to Smithfield Market for slaughter sometimes succumbed to the toxic air, collapsing in the streets. You make a mental note to avoid any impromptu street barbecues. One of the most notorious of these smog events was the Great Fog of 1879, Cite 474, which basically brought London to a standstill for the better part of a week. Reports from the Time describe it as a voluminous drapery of blackish yellow smoke, so dense that shops had to light lamps at midday, and even the Houses of Parliament had to suspend sessions because MPs couldn't see each other across the chamber, though some might argue that was occasionally a blessing. Trains were delayed for hours, their engineers inching along the tracks, while ships on the Thames lay at anchor, their foghorns moaning mournfully. The city held its breath, literally and figuratively, waiting for the fiendish fog to lift. You quickly learned that Londoners had a certain grim acceptance of these London particulars, as they were sometimes called. They'd tie handkerchiefs over their mouths, grope their way along familiar routes, and complain bitterly. But life somehow went on. For you, however, each breath is an effort, each step into the swirling unknown a minor act of faith. The fog seems to accentuate the cold, making it feel even more penetrating and damp. You can only imagine what this was doing to the lungs of those who lived here year after year. They must have had an entirely different definition of fresh air, probably something that didn't actively try to choke you. The visual spectacle, if you can call it that, is one of eerie, almost beautiful desolation. The gas lamps cast diffuse haloed glows, like dying stars in a dirty nebula. Familiar shapes become monstrous and alien. You feel a profound sense of isolation, even surrounded by the unseen thousands. It's a perfect setting for a ghostly tale, or perhaps just a really bad chest infection. You start to understand why Sherlock Holmes was always solving crimes in foggy London. It wasn't just for atmosphere. It was probably the only weather they had half the time. Emerging from the choking embrace of a pea souper, you find your lungs desperately craving something, anything, that doesn't feel like inhaling a damp chimney. As the acrid taste slowly fades, you turn your attention to another, almost mythical feature of London winters past, the River Thames itself, frozen solid. While the full-blown, multi-week freezes that allowed for the legendary frost fairs were becoming rarer by the high Victorian era, the memory of them, and the occasional shorter freeze, still lingered powerfully in the city's consciousness. It's a spectacle that seems almost unthinkable today. The mighty Thames transformed from a bustling artery of commerce into a vast, icy playground. These weren't just casual skating parties. The Thames Frost Fairs were a tradition dating back to at least the 15th century site, 479, a direct consequence of those much colder winters brought on by the Little Ice Age. Imagine entire temporary towns springing up on the ice, complete with streets of stalls, raucous drinking tents, and all manner of entertainments. It was London's version of a snow day, but on a truly epic, slightly unhinged scale. You wander out onto the surprisingly solid surface, the usual sounds of the river, the lapping water, the cries of boatmen, replaced by an echoing silence. Under your feet, punctuated by the shouts of vendors and the laughter of merrymakers, the air, though still bitingly cold, feels cleaner here, away from the worst of the city's smoke. All around you is a scene of delightful chaos. There are stalls selling everything from gingerbread and roasted chestnuts to cheap trinkets and potent, steaming gin punch. The original antifreeze, you suppose. You see an ox roasts being performed right on the ice, Site 480. The smell of sizzling meat mingling with the wood smoke. You'd think an open fire on a frozen river would be a health and safety nightmare. But the Victorians, bless their cotton socks, had a more learn-by-doing or possibly drowning approach to risk assessment. Enterprising printers would haul their heavy presses onto the ice, churning out keepsake tickets and poems for revelers to commemorate the occasion. Site 480. It was the ultimate novelty item, a tangible piece of this frozen wonder. People played games like Skittles, a type of bowling, and there were puppet shows, Site 480, musicians, and even temporary pubs, or fuddling tents, as they were charmingly called, where you could get thoroughly lubricated to ward off the chill. You can just imagine the conversations. Another pint, my good man, and make it snappy before we all become permanent fixtures in this ice sculpture. The last and arguably one of the grandest of these frost fairs took place in the winter of 1813-14, Site 481. For 4 solid weeks, the Thames was transformed into a boisterous winter carnival, complete with a main thoroughfare dubbed the City Road that stretched all the way from London Bridge to Blackfriars, Site 481. The star attraction of this particular fair, and a fact that still boggles the mind, was a parading elephant led across the river by its keeper, Site 481. Quite how they convinced an elephant that walking on a frozen river in London was a good career move, or what its risk assessment form looked like, remains a delightful historical mystery. Donkey rides, sledding tracks, and even a few enterprising pickpockets who took advantage of the festive crowds to ply their trade were also part of the scene. But alas, like all good, slightly dangerous parties, the era of the Great Thames Frost Fairs was drawing to a close. The winter of 1814, Thames Frost Fair would prove to be the river's last hera as a winter playground. Several factors contributed to their demise. Firstly, the Little Ice Age itself was beginning to wane, its icy grip on Europe slowly relaxing, leading to generally milder winters. The Thames simply didn't freeze over as deeply or as reliably as it once had. Secondly, the city of London itself was changing. The old medieval London Bridge, with its many narrow arches, had acted like a weir, slowing the river's flow and making it more prone to freezing. Its replacement in 1831 by a new bridge with wider arches, along with the later construction of the Victoria Embankment, sped up the river's current and deepened its channel, making a solid freeze far less likely. Historians still discuss the relative importance of these man-made alterations versus the broader climatic shift in consigning the frost fairs to history. It was probably a bit of both, nature turning down the thermostat while humans gave the river a bit more get up and go. And finally, the sheer industrialization and increased boat traffic on the Thames in the Victorian era made the idea of a spontaneous ice festival increasingly impractical and dangerous. A frozen Thames was no longer a novelty. It was a serious disruption to commerce. The city's pragmatic, industrious spirit was perhaps less inclined to down tools for a month-long party on the ice, no matter how many gin tents were involved. So, by the time the Victorian era was in full swing, the frost fairs had receded into the realm of folklore, Site 483, a nostalgic emblem of a wilder, colder, and perhaps more surprisingly festive past. For the generations of Londoners who grew up without ever witnessing one, these icy carnivals became the stuff of legend. Tales told by grandparents about a magical time when the river transformed into a winter wonderland. You can almost feel a pang of that Victorian nostalgia, a longing for a spectacle you've only just learned about but can already sense the unique magic of. It makes you wonder what remarkable, everyday marvels of our own time will be similarly lost to future generations, dismissed as too impractical or simply forgotten as the world changes around us. While the echoes of frost fair merriment and parading elephants on ice might dance in your head, you soon realize that for a vast portion of Victorian London's population, winter was no carnival. It was a grim, relentless battle for survival. As you venture away from the more prosperous thoroughfares and into the labyrinthine alleys and crowded tenements of areas like the East End, the festive veneer of the season cracks, revealing a chilling reality. The air here is even thicker with smoke, but it's the acrid, desperate smoke of scavenged, damp fuel rather than the hardy coal fires of wealthier districts. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer number of people out in the bitter cold, inadequately clad and visibly struggling. Threadbare shawls and coats patched with more patches offer little defense against the penetrating damp and icy winds. You see children with bare feet, their skin blue and chapped, darting through the slush, their eyes large and haunted. This isn't a Dickensian exaggeration. This is the daily grind for London's underclass when Jack Frost came calling. You quickly understand that your earlier discomfort was mere triviality compared to the life and death struggle unfolding before you. Your attention is drawn to the riverbanks at low tide, even in this freezing weather. Here, hunched figures, young and old, are engaged in the grim occupation of mudlarking. They scavenged the muddy banks of the rivers at low tide, scouring for bits of coal, rope, or anything of value to sell, Site 490. Their fingers, you imagine, must be numb beyond feeling, their bodies aching with cold. Some, you hear, even used metal plates strapped to their boots to venture further out onto the frozen river in search of treasures lodged in the ice. Site 491, a desperate gamble for a slightly better find. It's a profession that seems to combine all the worst aspects of treasure hunting and trench warfare. Then there are the match girls, figures who have become almost emblematic of Victorian winter poverty. You see them on street corners, often barely teenagers, sometimes younger, their faces pale in the flickering gaslight. They worked long, grueling hours in match factories, dealing with hazardous white phosphorus that could lead to the horrific condition known as phossy jaw, a disfiguring and sometimes fatal condition, Site 491. After their factory shift, many were forced to hawk their wares on the wintry streets, Site 492. Clad in little more than rags and shawls, they shivered on icy street corners. Newspapers of the time, you recall, told pitiful stories of match girls found frozen to death, their unsold wares scattered around them on the snow, Site 492. Suddenly, your own desire for a warm drink feels incredibly self-indulgent. For those, with a roof however dilapidated over their heads, the primary concern was fuel. Coal, the lifeblood of a Victorian hearth, saw its price soar during cold snaps, forcing many to choose between warmth and other necessities. Site 492. You learn that some desperate souls bought coal dust and trash from the dustmen to burn, a cheaper but dirtier fuel that added to the city's oppressive smog. You can only imagine the quality of the air inside those cramped rooms, already thick with the fumes of daily life. It's a wonder the whole city didn't go up in a puff of self-generated smog. Pawn shops did a brisk trade in the winter months, as desperate Londoners hawked their possessions to buy coal and food. But on 493, the cold was a relentless invader. In the poorly constructed tenements, it seeped through cracks in the walls, under warped doors, and through broken window panes often stuffed with rags or paper in a futile attempt to keep the drafts out. Overcrowding was rampant, with multiple families sometimes sharing a single unheated room, relying on shared body heat as much as any scant fire. Frostbite and chilblains were common afflictions, leaving fingers and toes swollen, itchy, and agonizingly painful. You see people with hands wrapped in rags, their faces etched with the misery of constant, gnawing cold. Food, too, was a constant worry. While the wealthy might complain about the price of out-of-season asparagus, for the poor, winter meant a diet that was monotonous at best and perilously meager at worst. Stale bread, thin gruel, and perhaps a bit of questionable meat if they were lucky. The dream of a Christmas goose, you discover, was so aspirational for many working-class families that they joined goose clubs, a kind of savings scheme in which members paid a few pennies a week into a communal fund, so that at Christmas time, the money was used to buy a goose for each member's family. It's a poignant image, an entire year of scrimping for a single decent meal. Social historians continue to debate the extent to which seasonal winter unemployment, as opposed to chronic underemployment, was the primary driver of acute distress among London's poor during these bitter months. Regardless of the precise academic definitions, the suffering you witness is stark and undeniable. You start to think that perhaps the real Victorian values were less about stiff upper lips and more about an incredible, desperate capacity to endure the unendurable. As you observe the crushing poverty that winter magnifies on London's streets, you realize that for many, there's one final dreaded option when all else fails: the Union Workhouse. These imposing, often grim-looking institutions were the Victorian era's answer to extreme destitution, a system largely shaped by the New Poor Law of 1834. The philosophy was simple, if brutal: make parish relief so unappealing that only the truly desperate would seek it. And in the depths of a freezing winter, with starvation and exposure a tangible threat, the workhouse gates saw a steady stream of London's most vulnerable souls. You decide with a shiver that's not entirely from the cold to take a closer look. Approaching one of these establishments, you feel an immediate sense of foreboding. The architecture is stark, utilitarian, often resembling a prison more than a place of refuge. The windows are small and high, the walls thick and grimy. There's an atmosphere of hushed despair, a palpable sense of resignation hanging in the icy air. This isn't a cozy B&B with a vacancy sign. This is the place you go when you have absolutely nowhere else. Stepping inside, hypothetically of course, unless you fancy trading your return ticket for a louse-ridden uniform, you're met with a scene of regimented bleakness. The first order of business for new arrivals, or inmates as they were chillingly called, was to be stripped of their own clothes, bathed, often in cold water, a truly invigorating welcome in January, and issued a coarse, ill-fitting uniform. Personal possessions were confiscated, any last vestiges of individual identity scrubbed away. It's the ultimate minimalist lifestyle, whether you asked for it or not. The sexes were strictly segregated, meaning husbands and wives, parents and children were separated upon entry site, 495. Families were torn apart, allowed perhaps a brief, supervised meeting once a week if they were lucky. Imagine the heartbreak of a mother handing over her child to a stern-faced matron, unsure when she might properly see them again. It was a system designed to break spirits as much as to provide shelter. The living conditions are, to put it mildly, basic. Spartan dormitories were often unheated, with thin blankets and straw-filled sacks for bedding, Site 495. You'd be forgiven for thinking the interior decorator was a fan of extreme discomfort. Privacy is non-existent. You sleep, eat, and exist in the constant company of strangers, all sharing the same misfortune. The reference script mentions, meager portions of GRL and bread did little to fuel the long hours of manual labor required of the inmates. Site 495, painting a vivid picture of the discomfort. And then there's the food. Gourmet it is not. The diet is deliberately monotonous and meager, designed to provide bare subsistence and nothing more. Gruel, a thin, watery porridge, is a staple, often served for breakfast and supper, perhaps a small portion of bread and a lump of cheese, or a watery soup with a few sundigged vegetables floating in it for dinner. The reference material mentions a rare bit of meat in the dinner stew, Site 496, suggesting that was an occasion probably marked on the calendar. Forget artisanal sourdough. You're lucky if the bread isn't actively trying to escape your plate. In return for this less than luxurious accommodation, inmates were expected to work and work hard. The labor was often deliberately pointless and demeaning, designed to instill discipline and deter others from seeking relief. Men might find themselves breaking stones in a cold yard, picking oakum, the tedious task of teasing apart old tard, ropes for reuse in shipbuilding, or grinding corn with a heavy hand mill. Women might be set to laundry work in steamy, damp conditions, scrubbing endless piles of linen or sewing. The hours were long, the supervision strict, and the reward, simply the right to stay another day. It's like a really terrible gym membership where you pay with your dignity. Historians continue to discuss whether the workhouse system ultimately reduced poverty or merely hid it behind imposing walls, offering little in the way of genuine rehabilitation. Whatever the reasoning, the result for those inside was often a slow crushing of the human spirit. The monotony, the lack of control, the constant hunger and cold, it all took its toll. Yet even in these grim surroundings, small flickers of humanity could sometimes be found. The shared hardship might foster a sense of camaraderie among the inmates, a whispered story, a shared glance of understanding, perhaps even a hot cup of tea ladled out in the morning. Site 496, by a slightly less fearsome member of staff, could be a lifeline, but these were small crumbs of comfort in an ocean of privation. For many, the workhouse was a place where hope went to die, a grim waiting room for an even grimmer end. You can see it in the eyes of the people around you, a dull, vacant stare that speaks of broken wills and extinguished dreams. It's a sobering reminder that the good old days were often anything but, especially if you found yourself on the wrong side of fortune's wheel during a Victorian winter. After what feels like an eternity spent exploring the icy underbelly of Victorian London, from the grim realities of street poverty to the even grimmer realities of the workhouse, you begin to notice a subtle shift in the air. The days, while still short, are perhaps a fraction less brutal in their dimness. You hear a new sound, a persistent, almost musical dripping as icicles. Those crystal daggers that have adorned every eave and windowsill begin to weep in the slightly less ferocious cold. It's the first tentative whisper of the great thaw. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the city begins to emerge from its frozen slumber. The mountains of snow that choke the streets gradually shrink, transforming into rivers of gray, gritty slush. This, you quickly realize, presents its own set of challenges. London, never the cleanest of cities, now seems to be actively dissolving into a primordial soup of mud, melted snow, horse manure, and general refuse. The reference script mentions rivulets that flowed through the streets and sewers, Site 505, and the snow turning to muddy slush beneath the feet of its citizens, Site 505. Crossing the road becomes an act of bravery, or perhaps just Wellington-booted foolishness. You can only imagine the state of the city's drains, probably staging a protest by now. For the city's poorest, the arrival of warmer weather brings a complex mix of relief and new anxieties. The daily, life-threatening battle against freezing to death is eased, a monumental relief in itself. You see fewer people huddled in doorways, fewer children with that telltale blue tinge to their skin. However, as the source material suggests, the thaw could mean seasonal work dried up and food prices rose. The threat of disease loomed in the warming air, Site 499 too. Mudlarks and ragpickers continue their thankless tasks along the now even muckier riverbanks. The treasures they seek perhaps slightly less frozen, but no less elusive. The costermongers and matchgirls are still out, their cries for custom perhaps a little stronger now that their jaws aren't frozen shut. In the grander parts of town, the West End, the signs of spring are more unequivocally cheerful. The ponderous wheels of high society begin to turn once more. You see carriages, now able to navigate the streets with greater ease, depositing elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen at the doors of imposing townhouses. The reference script mentions debutantes donned frothy gowns for their coming-out balls, and gentlemen sported daffodils in their buttonholes as they rode in the park, Site 499. The London season, that whirlwind of balls, dinners, and social maneuvering, is gearing up. It's a stark contrast to the East End, where the arrival of spring might simply mean a different kind of dampness in your single overcrowded room. In the parks and public gardens, if you can brave the mud, the first signs of new life are bravely pushing through the cold earth. Hardy crocuses and snow drops gave way to a riot of spring blooms, Site 501. The great glass palaces like Kew Gardens and the Crystal Palace, which you can imagine were freezing sarcophagi during the depths of winter, now sparkled in the strengthening sun, their exotic plants a riot of color and scent, Site 501. On the Thames, the ice finally breaks up with groans and cracks, and soon the first pleasure boats of the season chugged merrily down the river, their decks crowded with day trippers, Site 501. It's like the city itself is taking a deep, cleansing breath. There's a widely known historical fact that spring cleaning became a more pronounced ritual in the Victorian era, partly due to the sheer amount of soot and grime accumulated from months of coal fires burning in poorly ventilated rooms. You can picture households, from the grandest to the humblest that could afford it, throwing open windows to air out the stale, smoky atmosphere, beating carpets with a vengeance, and scrubbing away winter's grimy signature. It must have been a battle against an entire season's worth of filth. An eccentric aspect of the changing season might have been the proliferation of street performers and vendors selling peculiar spring tonics and remedies, promising to cleanse the system of winter's ills. After months of a monotonous, often nutrient-poor diet for many, you can imagine people flocking to buy concoctions of sarsaparilla or dandelion and burdock, hoping to literally taste the spring. Social historians debate whether the apparent increase in public activity during spring was due to genuine economic improvement or simply the populace's desperate need for respite after months of indoor confinement. For you as an observer, the city in thaw is a place of contradictions. There's an undeniable sense of hope and renewal in the air. Children, finally released from the confines of cramped rooms, do indeed play in the mud, their cheeks ruddy with the promise of spring, Site 499. Coats and scarves are gradually shed, yet the memory of winter's brutality lingers. The ghostly reminder of the human cost, Site 502 for the privileged and the direct painful memory for the poor. The Char city might be shaking off its icy shackles, but the deeper social and economic divides remain etched as clearly as frost on a window pane. You realize that for many Londoners, surviving one winter was simply a brief respite before the anxieties of the next began to gather. It's a cycle, and spring, for all its beauty, is just one part of it. Just as you were starting to appreciate the muddy, chaotic relief of a Victorian spring, your temporal journey takes a sharp, icy turn. You find yourself whisked away, not forward, but deeper into the folklore of London's brutal winters, landing at the onset of one particularly legendary deep freeze, the Great Winter of 1894-95. The air changes, the temperature plummets with an alarming swiftness, and you get the distinct feeling that this isn't your average London chill. This is winter deciding to go full theatrical. It all begins in late November, as the source material describes, when the first flakes drifted down from a slate gray sky, Site 542. At first you observe Londoners paying it little heed, well accustomed to the chill and damp of the season. They pulled their coats tighter, stoked their coal fires, and went about their business. Site 543, probably muttering about the usual British weather. Little do they, or you, know that this is merely a prelude to the great winter that was to come. Site 543. You can almost hear a dramatic chord playing in the background. As December dawns, the snowfall becomes relentless. It's no longer a gentle dusting, but a serious, committed blizzard. The snow fell thicker and faster. Site 543. It piled up in the streets, blanketed rooftops, and turned parks into glistening wonderlands. Site 543. Children, of course, are ecstatic. The source mentions they rejoiced at the unexpected holiday, pelting each other with snowballs and careening down hills on makeshift sleds. Site 543. You can imagine the quality of those makeshift sleds, probably a tea tray and a prayer. For the adults, however, this winter wonderland quickly becomes a logistical nightmare, with snarled traffic, collapsed roofs, and made even the simplest errands a miserable slog. Site 543. The cold doesn't just bite, it gnaws. Temperatures plummeted to depths rarely seen in the temperate climes of southern England. Site 544. Thermometers, those stoic observers of misery, recorded lows not witnessed in decades. Site 544. And then, the truly extraordinary happens. London's great river, the Thames, begins to freeze. This isn't just a bit of ice around the edges. The source states it became a solid sheet from bank to bank, its normal traffic of ferries and barges locked in place. Site 544. It was, as the text vividly puts it, as if the very lifeblood of the city had frozen in its veins. Site 544. Such a deep freeze of the Thames hadn't been seen since the last of the great frost fairs more than 80 years prior, in 1814. Site 545. You recall the tales of those earlier carnivals, the ox roasts and the elephant on the ice. Now, as the river ices over once more, a similar, if smaller scale scene begins to unfold. The source describes how some intrepid souls ventured out, testing the surface. Site 545. Some skated, others strolled, marveling at the strange sensation of walking on water. Site 545. And, true to London's entrepreneurial spirit, enterprising vendors even set up stalls hawking meat pies, roasted chestnuts, and hot gin. It seems the moment there's a captive audience, someone will try to sell them a pie, even if that audience is standing on a frozen river of questionable stability. But, as the source material warns, this was no pleasure garden. Site 546. The ice, while thick, was not the smooth expanse of yore. It buckled and cracked, a treacherous landscape riven with fishes. Site 546. The foolhardy who ventured too far risked plunging into the frigid depths. Site 546. Even on what you thought was solid ground, danger is everywhere. Londoners slipped on slick cobblestones, broke bones on icy stairs, and suffered the nip of frostbite if they lingered outside too long. Site 546. You make a mental note to invest in some hypothetical Victorian-era ice cleats, if such a thing even exists. The winter of 1894 to 95 is indeed a well-documented historical fact as being exceptionally severe, not just in London but across much of Europe. Climatologists and historians continue to analyze whether the extreme cold of the 1894-95 winter represented a final, intense pulse of the departing Little Ice Age, or if it was a more unique atmospheric event, perhaps influenced by distant volcanic activity or unusual oceanic currents. For you, standing in the middle of it, the primary concern is less about the cause and more about finding an extra pair of socks. You observe the city slowly grinding to a halt. The usual hustle and bustle is replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the crunch of your own footsteps in the fresh snow and the distant muffled sounds of a city struggling to function. This isn't just a heavy snowfall. It's an occupation by an icy adversary, and it's only just beginning. The festive spirit of the first snowfall is quickly giving way to a grim realization. This winter is going to be a long, hard slog. You can already see the strain on people's faces, the growing anxiety in their eyes. This is the kind of winter that stories will be told about for generations, a true test of London's famed resilience. As the Great Freeze of 1894–95 tightens its icy grip on London, you begin to see with startling clarity how this extreme weather doesn't just chill the bones, but also throws the city's stark social divisions into even sharper relief. It's a tale of two cities existing side by side, yet worlds apart in their experience of winter's onslaught. One London shivers in opulent drawing rooms, occasionally venturing out for frosty amusements, while the other battles for sheer survival in the frozen slums. Let's first take a stroll, albeit a very brisk one, through the West End, where the well-to-do are finding ways to make even this brutal winter a fashionable affair. You see them promenaded in furs and velvets, Site 518 on the frozen Serpentine, their servants perhaps tasked with building crackling bonfires on the bank. Site 518 to offer a moment's respite from the cold. Ice skating, a beloved Victorian pastime, is in full swing. On the frozen Serpentine, ladies in elaborate winter costumes and gentlemen in top hats glide with varying degrees of skill, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. For those seeking a more controlled environment, the Crystal Palace skaters, in bright woolens, twirled to the music of an orchestra on a rink made from 3 acres of artificial ice, Site 518. Imagine the pressure, trying to look graceful while simultaneously avoiding frostbite and a public tumble. The fashionable set, as the source notes, had its winter novelties, from ostrich muffs to man-rimmed pices. Site 518. You might even spot the daring Lady Frances Harbiton, who, according to the provided text, scandalized society by wearing bloomers to go ice skating, Site 518. A practical choice, no doubt, but one that probably caused more than a few monocles to drop. And then there's the almost legendary dedication to a chilly aesthetic, exemplified by the famed dandy known as Beau Brummel, who, the source claims, was said to take a warm bath each morning, then stand naked before an open window until fully air-dried and chilled before dressing. Site 519. That's not just fashion, that's performance art, with a high risk of pneumonia. Lavish, frost-themed balls, Site 507, become the talk of the town with ice sculptures and shimmering decor. Site 507, transforming grand ballrooms into winter wonderlands. Here, ladies had swanned about in gowns of silver and white, while gentlemen cut dashing figures on the dance floor in their tailcoats and top hats. Seat 507. And what did they sip to keep the chill at bay? Perhaps some of Carlo Gotti's exotic ices and chilled champagne. Gotti, the Swiss-Italian entrepreneur, had built a veritable business empire from ice, importing great blocks of it from the frozen fjords of Norway, Site 553, 579. His establishments became the place to see and be seen as socialites flocked there for ices and gossip. Site 580, a truly cool place to hang out in every sense of the word. Now you take a sharp turn and the glittering world of Mayfair fades. You find yourself back in the East End and the picture is devastatingly different. Here, winter is not a backdrop for amusement but an active, relentless enemy. The ragged street urchins risked frostbite and chilblains hawking matches and chestnuts, Site 517. Laborers toiled in the bone-chilling damp of the docks and the dust-choked cold of the brickyards, Site 517. In the wretched squalor of the East End slums, entire families huddled in windowless rooms, burning scraps and furniture for a pitiful wisp of warmth, Site 517. The source chillingly states that the destitute resorted to burning rubbish, old shoes, anything to ward off the killing cold, Site 547. The previous attempts at humor about inadequate clothing feel deeply inappropriate here. The reality is too stark. For these poorest Londoners, the severe freeze means that the already difficult task of finding fuel becomes a desperate scramble. Coal prices, already high, skyrocket. The queues for charitable coal distributions grow longer, the rations smaller. You see ragged children haunting the streets, their bare feet wrapped in scraps of burlap, their pinched faces blue with cold as they begged for coppers or combed icy gutters for bits of cinder to sell, Site 547. It's a world away from ostrich, muffs and ice sculptures. The simple act of getting water becomes an ordeal. As the source mentions, pipes froze, leaving entire buildings without water, Site 548. Imagine washerwomen's hands cracked and bled as they plunged them into icy tubs, Site 548. Even inside, ink froze in wells, milk froze in pails, and bread seemed to turn to stone on the sideboard, Site 548. The cold isn't just outside. It invades every aspect of life. Historians continue to analyze the extent to which the highly visible winter pastimes of the wealthy served as a social distraction from, or a stark emphasis of, the profound inequalities gripping Victorian London. The contrast is almost unbearable. In one part of the city, people are debating the merits of Norwegian versus American ice for their sorbets. In another, they're debating whether burning a piece of their own chair will provide enough warmth to see them through the night. It's this juxtaposition that defines the icy society. The pleasures of the few are built upon, or at least, exist in stark indifference to, the perils of the many. You might see a fine carriage, its occupants snug in furs, splash slush onto a shivering match girl, neither world truly acknowledging the other, except in these fleeting, brutal interactions. It's enough to make you want to start a snowball fight with a very specific, socially conscious target list. Having witnessed the starkly different ways London's rich and poor endure the Great Freeze, you now turn your attention to the city's very arteries, its transport and trade. In an era utterly reliant on the constant movement of goods and people, a severe winter like that of 1894-95 doesn't just cause discomfort, it threatens to bring the entire metropolis to a grinding, shivering halt. You quickly see that London, for all its imperial might, is surprisingly vulnerable when nature decides to throw a particularly icy tantrum. Your first observation point is the River Thames, normally a teeming highway of commerce, with barges, ferries and steamships constantly plying its waters. It's now an eerily static landscape of ice. The source material confirms that during such a deep freeze, the river became a solid sheet from bank to bank, its normal traffic of ferries and barges locked in place. Site 544. Imagine the scene. Vessels of all sizes caught mid-journey, their crews stranded, their precious cargoes of coal, timber, food, and other vital supplies unable to reach the city's wharves. The Port of London, the busiest in the world, is effectively closed for business. It's like a modern-day global supply chain crisis, but with more icicles and a distinct lack of container ships. This riverine paralysis has immediate knock-on effects. London, even in the late 19th century, was heavily dependent on coal, not just for domestic heating, but to power its industries and its burgeoning railway network. Much of this coal arrived by sea and river. With the Thames frozen, coal deliveries dwindle, leading to shortages and, inevitably, price hikes. The poor, already struggling to afford fuel, are hit hardest, but even wealthier households and businesses feel the pinch. It's a chilling reminder of how interconnected and fragile these supply lines were. On land, the situation is hardly better. The streets, already treacherous with packed ice and snow drifts taller than a man, Site 517, become an almost impassable quagmire. Horse-drawn omnibuses, the city's main form of public transport, struggle to gain purchase, their horses slipping and straining. Carriages and delivery wagons get stuck, their wheels spinning uselessly. The source mentions that the heavy snow, snarled traffic, collapsed roofs, and made even the simplest errands a miserable slog. Site 543. You might see some enterprising cabbies fitted their hansoms with sleigh runners and charged double for dashing through the snowy streets. Site 578. A brief, picturesque novelty in an otherwise grim transport landscape. But for the most part, getting around is a slow, hazardous, and often impossible endeavor. Forget complaining about your train being 5 minutes late. Here, you're lucky if it moves at all. The railways themselves, those iron sinews of Victorian progress, are also under siege. Frozen points, snow-clogged lines, and obscured signals cause massive delays and cancellations. The source description of the Great Fog of 1879 notes, trains ground to a halt, unable to see signals through the murk. Site 550. A similar situation would arise with heavy snowfall. This further exacerbates the shortages of essential goods, including food. London was a city that consumed vast quantities of produce, meat, and grain daily, much of it brought in by rail. With trains delayed or canceled, the markets begin to empty, and the specter of hunger looms larger, especially for those with no reserves to fall back on. Even businesses built on cold, like Carlo Gatti's ice empire, face peculiar challenges. While local ice is now abundant, if not particularly clean, Gatti pioneered the importation of ice from the frozen fjords of Norway, Site 559. His business relied on great shipborne blocks, being hauled across oceans to satisfy the cravings of a sweltering public, Site 560, or a winter public wanting exotic ice for their parties. With the Thames frozen and docks potentially iced in, his precious cargo of pure Norwegian ice might be stuck just out of reach, a truly ironic situation for an ice magnate. The carts laden with ice blocks trundling from the docks, Site 560, would certainly not be trundling anywhere fast. The overall economic impact is significant. Businesses struggle to get raw materials and distribute finished goods. Workers can't get to their jobs. Shops run out of stock. Economic historians continue to analyze the resilience of London's informal economy during such transport crises, questioning whether it adapted more effectively through localized, small-scale efforts than formal trade networks could. You see evidence of this adaptability in the enterprising vendors who, as the source notes from the 1894-95 freeze on the Thames, set up stalls hawking meat pies, roasted chestnuts, and hot gin, a spontaneous microeconomy born of frozen opportunity. It's the Victorian equivalent of a pop-up shop, just considerably colder and with a higher chance of wet feet. Clearing the snow from the main thoroughfares was a monumental task, often undertaken by poorly paid casual laborers armed with little more than shovels and brooms. There were no fleets of snowplows or salt spreaders. You can imagine the progress was painstakingly slow, and side streets and residential areas were likely left to the mercy of the elements for weeks on end. It makes you appreciate the unseen army of municipal workers who keep modern cities moving, even in bad weather. Here it feels like the city is fighting a losing battle against a relentless, frozen tide. The paralysis isn't just physical, it's economic and social, a stark demonstration of nature's power to humble even the greatest of human endeavors. Beyond the widespread paralysis of transport and trade, the great freeze you're witnessing unleashes a host of more direct and, often deadly, catastrophes upon London. It's one thing for your coal delivery to be late. It's quite another when the very ice under your feet or the roof over your head decides to become an active threat. You soon learn that winter in Victorian London wasn't just inconvenient. It could be downright lethal, turning everyday scenes into potential disaster zones. One of the most chilling examples of this is the peril of frozen waterways. While a solidly frozen Thames might host impromptu fairs, lesser bodies of water, or thinner ice, presented a deadly temptation, especially to a populace starved for winter amusement. You recall hearing about the memorable winter day in 1867, when the ice skating craze reached its tragic peak. The source paints a grim picture. The ornamental lake in London's Regent's Park had frozen over, and hundreds of skaters flocked to its mirror-like surface. But as the day wore on and more people ventured onto the ice, a sickening crack rang out. In an instant, the ice gave way, plunging scores of skaters into the frigid water. Chaos erupted. Bystanders rushed to help, forming human chains to pull the survivors to safety. But for many, it was too late. The grim tally, as the source records, was 40 people had lost their lives, drowned in the icy depths on what was meant to be a day of fun and frivolity, Site 593. It's a sobering thought, a joyful winter pastime turning into a mass casualty event. You can only imagine the terror of that icy plunge, the shock of the cold water, the desperate struggle in the darkness beneath the broken ice. And it wasn't just skaters at risk. The source mentions that even during the 1814 Frost Fair, revelers could stumble into holes in the ice never to be seen again if they'd had one tipple too many at frost fairs on the Thames, Site 577. Clearly, alcohol and treacherous ice were a historically bad combination. Then there's the ever-present danger of fire, a hazard magnified significantly by the winter cold. With every household burning coal, wood, or as you've seen among the poor, rubbish, old shoes, anything to ward off the killing cold, Site 547. The risk of an errant spark igniting flammable materials was incredibly high. Chimneys, overworked, and often poorly maintained, could catch fire. Overheated stoves could set nearby furnishings alight. The source even notes that housemaids boiling water for tea started countless fires with hands gone clumsy from chilblains. Site 5-77. It's a tragic irony. The very act of seeking warmth could lead to fiery destruction. Fighting these blazes in the depths of winter was a heroic, if often futile, endeavor. Imagine horse-drawn fire engines, heavy and cumbersome, trying to navigate streets slick with ice or choked with snow. Water sources like hydrants or public pumps could be frozen solid. Hoses would freeze and crack. Firefighters, already battling the inferno, would also be contending with frostbite and treacherous footing. It was a fireman's nightmare, and one that too often ended in tragedy for the occupants of burning buildings. You'd need more than a bucket chain. You'd need a miracle, and possibly a very large hairdryer for the hydrants. Beyond dramatic accidents and infernos, the relentless cold waged a quieter, but no less deadly, war on the health of Londoners. Respiratory illnesses like bronchitis, pneumonia, and influenza thrived in the cold, damp, and polluted air. Tuberculosis, already a scourge, found fertile ground in overcrowded, unventilated tenements where people huddled together for warmth. The source confirms that frostbite and hypothermia were rampant, claiming the lives of those too weak or ill-equipped to withstand the chill. Site 602, among the poor, the elderly and the very young were particularly vulnerable, their bodies less able to cope with the sustained stress of the cold. Even Queen Victoria herself, in her relatively well-heated residences, came down with a nasty case of bronchitis owing to the severe weather. Site 524 in 1871, a testament to how pervasive these winter ailments were. Public health historians continue to examine the complex interplay between cold temperatures, air pollution from coal smoke, and the prevalence of deadly respiratory diseases in Victorian cities. Hospitals like St. Thomas's, as the source mentions, even had standing orders for hot toddy and rum to revive patients suffering from exposure. While a tot of rum might sound like a pleasant prescription, it highlights the desperate measures needed to combat severe hypothermia. It's probably not what your doctor would recommend today, but in Victorian London, it was cutting-edge emergency care, and the list of winter hazards continues. Heavy snowfalls could lead to roof collapses, especially on older, poorly maintained buildings. Large icicles forming on eaves and gutters could become lethal projectiles if they broke off and fell onto unsuspecting pedestrians below. Even the simple act of walking could be fraught with peril, with icy streets, a gauntlet of danger strewn with broken bones from falls. Site 577. It's a wonder anyone made it to spring in one piece. The whole city seemed to be booby-trapped by winter. You begin to see that surviving wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about navigating a constant barrage of potential disasters, a frosty obstacle course where the stakes were life and death. After witnessing the cascade of catastrophes that a severe Victorian winter could unleash, from deadly ice to raging fires and rampant illness, you might be forgiven for thinking that London was a city entirely consumed by frozen despair. But amidst the hardship and the horror, you also begin to notice something else, something remarkably resilient, the enduring warmth of human kindness and the stubborn spark of community spirit. It seems that the colder the weather, the more determined some Londoners became to look out for one another. The Victorian era, for all its stark inequalities, was also a period that saw a significant rise in philanthropic endeavors. As you navigate the frosty streets, you see signs of this organized charity at work. Soup kitchens, often run by religious groups or private benefactors, ladle out steaming bowls of broth and bread to long queues of shivering men, women, and children. The source material mentions how charitable Victorians distributed hot meals, blankets, and coal tickets to the needy. Site 493. Churches and public buildings sometimes opened their doors to provide temporary shelter on the coldest nights. Site 493. These efforts, while perhaps a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the suffering, represented a vital lifeline for many. You might even come across a distribution point for the Lord Mayor of London's emergency fund for the suffering poor, which the source notes was launched during the brutal Siberian winter of 1890-91, Site 522. Imagine the scene. Officials, perhaps slightly self-important, but hopefully well-meaning, handing out precious coal and bread, Site 522, to a grateful, if desperate, crowd. It's easy to be cynical about the motivations. Was it guilt, a desire to prevent riots, or genuine compassion? Historians and sociologists continue to evaluate the complex motivations behind Victorian philanthropy, discussing the interplay of genuine compassion, religious duty, and the desire to maintain social stability. But for the person receiving that life-saving lump of coal, the academic debate probably felt rather distant. Beyond these more formal efforts, you witness countless smaller informal acts of kindness. Neighbors in crowded tenements might share a meager fire or a bit of hoarded food. Those with slightly more might offer a warm drink or a cast-off blanket to someone less fortunate. There's a sense that when pushed to the brink, people often find a way to help each other, even if they have very little themselves. A particularly charming example of this community self-help was the Goose Club. As the source explains, these were a kind of saving scheme in which members paid a few pennies a week into a communal fund. Come Christmas, the money was used to buy a goose for each member's family, ensuring a hearty holiday meal even in lean times. Site 494. These clubs often met in local pubs, providing a much-needed refuge from the cold. Site 494. It's a lovely image of working-class solidarity, a small act of defiance against winter's bleakness. They weren't just saving for a goose, they were investing in a moment of shared joy and abundance. And then there are the more dramatic instances of shared resilience in the face of specific crises. You recall the story from the Great Winter of 1894-95 about the frost-bound flotilla, when a group of barges laden with coal and other vital supplies found themselves trapped in the frozen canal. The bargemen didn't just resign themselves to their fate. Instead, they banded together, lashing their vessels into an impromptu floating village. Site 567. For weeks they shared food, fuel, and companionship, huddled around makeshift fires on the ice. Site 567. The source even mentions they swapped stories and songs, and even held spirited competitions of skittles played on the frozen canal. Site 567. What's more, when word of their plight spread, Londoners were flocking to the canal's banks, bearing gifts of food, clothing, and coal. It's a heartwarming testament to how adversity could foster connection and generosity. You also hear of the Royal Humane Society, whose men were posted with ladders and ropes to rescue those who fell through the ice during skating mishaps, and the Temperance Societies, who, despite their primary mission to combat the demon drink, set up tea and coffee stands to lure shivering souls away. Site 579. From the less wholesome comforts of the Gin Palace, every little bit helped. It's almost like the city had its own volunteer emergency services, powered by tea and good intentions. Even in the darkest, coldest moments, people found ways to maintain morale. The source speaks of Londoners finding small comforts and simple joys to light the darkest days. Site 555. Laughter, a shared song, a bit of gossip around a sputtering fire. These were the small acts of rebellion against winter's oppressive regime. Pubs, for all their association with social ills, also served as vital warm social hubs where people could escape their freezing homes and find a brief respite. You might not get a gourmet meal, but a pint and a bit of human contact could make a world of difference. Perhaps the true Victorian spirit wasn't just about enduring hardship stoically, but about finding these sparks of light, these moments of connection in the midst of it all. It's a powerful reminder that even when circumstances are brutal, the human capacity for warmth, in every sense of the word, can be truly incredible. While acts of charity and community spirit certainly provided crucial warmth to the soul during London's harsh winters, they could do little to combat the very real and often deadly toll the season took on the physical health of its inhabitants. You quickly learn that winter in this era wasn't just about feeling cold. It was a season of pervasive sickness, where the Grim Reaper seemed to work overtime, especially in the poorer, overcrowded districts. The combination of relentless cold, persistent damp, malnutrition, and the ever-present noxious winter pea super, Site 470, created a perfect breeding ground for a host of ailments, particularly respiratory diseases. Bronchitis was rampant. Even Queen Victoria herself, as the source reminds us, came down with a nasty case of bronchitis owing to the severe weather. Site 524 in 1871. If the Queen, in her relatively comfortable palaces, wasn't immune, you can only imagine the plight of those living in drafty, unheated tenements. Pneumonia, often a swift and fatal consequence of a lingering cold, claimed countless lives. Influenza, or the grip as it was often called, could sweep through communities with devastating speed, leaving weakness and secondary infections in its wake. And then there was consumption, tuberculosis, the Great White Plague of the 19th century, which found an easy ally in the weakened lungs and compromised immune systems of those battered by winter's hardships. Children were tragically vulnerable. Infant and child mortality rates in Victorian cities were already shockingly high by modern standards, and winter only amplified the dangers. Diseases like whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever, all highly contagious and potentially deadly before the advent of widespread vaccination and antibiotics, could spread like wildfire through cramped, unsanitary homes where families huddled together for warmth. A simple childhood cough in winter could quickly escalate into something far more sinister. You can almost hear the heartbreaking chorus of tiny, rasping coughs echoing through the narrow alleyways. The direct effects of the cold itself were brutal. Frostbite and chilblains were common complaints, as the source notes for street urchins, hawking matches and chestnuts. Site 517. Chilblains, those itchy, swollen, and painful inflammations of the skin caused by exposure to cold and damp, might sound like a minor inconvenience, but for those who had to work outdoors or lived in perpetually cold conditions, they were a constant source of misery. Frostbite, far more serious, could lead to the loss of fingers, toes, and even limbs if not treated, though treatment itself was often rudimentary. And, as the source chillingly states, frostbite and hypothermia were rampant, claiming the lives of those too weak or ill-equipped to withstand the chill. Site 602. You realize that simply falling asleep in an unheated room or getting lost in the freezing fog could be a death sentence. Certain occupations carried their own specific winter health hazards. You recall the plight of the match girls, not only enduring the cold while selling their wares, but also facing the horrific industrial disease known as phossy jaw, Site 491. This condition, a disfiguring and sometimes fatal condition caused by exposure to white phosphorus, Site 491, in match factories, led to painful abscesses in the jawbone, severe disfigurement, and often a slow, agonizing death. While not exclusively a winter ailment, the added stress of cold and malnutrition likely made those suffering from it even more susceptible to its ravages. Victorian medicine, for all the scientific advancements of the age, had few effective answers to many of these winter afflictions. Doctors might prescribe bed rest, mustard plasters, which probably felt like setting your chest on fire, a counter-irritant if ever there was one, or various cough syrups and tonics, many of which were laced with opium or alcohol, offering temporary relief but no real cure. For serious infections, there were no antibiotics. Surgery was a dangerous proposition, often leading to fatal infections in itself. Public health initiatives were in their infancy, and understanding of germ theory was not yet widespread. Many still believed that diseases were caused by miasmas or bad airs. And to be fair, the London air in winter probably felt capable of causing any number of illnesses. You might stumble upon an advertisement for a popular Victorian cure-all, perhaps a patent medicine promising to banish coughs, colds, and general winter melancholy with a single potent and likely dubiously formulated dose. Some of these concoctions were truly bizarre, involving ingredients that would make a modern pharmacist's hair stand on end. It's a good reminder that Dr. Google isn't the first place people have turned for questionable medical advice. Historians actively debate the statistical accuracy of Victorian mortality records, particularly for the poorest urban districts during severe winter outbreaks, questioning how many deaths went unrecorded or were misattributed to less specific causes like debility or old age, when cold and infection were the true culprits. It's clear, however, that winter significantly swelled the bills of mortality. The graveyards filled quickly during the cold months. It gives you a new appreciation for modern comforts like central heating, insulated homes, effective medicine, and even a basic understanding of hygiene. Here, just staying alive through the winter feels like a significant achievement. The constant gnawing cold, the damp that seeps into everything, the smoke-filled air, the inadequate diet, it all combined to create a perfect storm of ill health. You start to realize that the brutal in brutal Victorian winters refers to far more than just the temperature. After what feels like an age trapped in winter's icy, unforgiving embrace, you begin to sense a profound shift. The relentless bone-deep chill starts to lose its sharpest edge. The sun, a pale and distant memory for so long, seems to hang in the sky for a few precious minutes longer each day, and its watery rays carry just a hint more warmth. The great freeze is finally, slowly, beginning to surrender. As the icy grip of winter slowly loosened and spring's warmth began to return, Londoners cautiously emerged from their frost-bound hibernation. Site 505. This isn't an overnight transformation, but a gradual, messy, and often chaotic process as London sheds its frozen cloak. The first audible signs are the incessant patter of icicles dripped from eaves and awnings, their frozen tears a soothing lullaby heralding the change of seasons. Site 505. You see snowbanks shrank. Site 542. No longer pristine white, but stained gray and brown with city grime, slowly yielding to the slightly less frigid air. The mighty Thames, which had been a solid sheet from bank to bank, Site 544, begins to stir. The source vividly describes how the Tempa maze groaned and crackled as if protesting the end of its reign as a glittering pleasure. Ground, Site 575. Huge sheets of ice break apart with thunderous sounds, grinding against each other as the current reasserts its power. It's a dramatic, almost violent rebirth. On the streets, the transformation is equally dramatic, though perhaps less majestic. The packed snow and ice turn into a muddy slush beneath the feet of its citizens. Site 530. London's thoroughfares become a network of grimy puddles. Site 575. Shallow lakes of icy, filthy water that make every crossing an adventure. It's like the entire city has decided to take up bog snorkeling. The accumulated detritus of winter, coal dust, ash, horse manure, and general rubbish, all previously frozen into a solid, unholy mass, now thaws and mingles, creating an aroma that is uniquely London spring. You'd need more than a good pair of boots. You'd need a strong stomach. For the city's poorest inhabitants, the thaw brings an almost unimaginable relief. The destitute match girls and street urchins who had shivered in the frigid alleyways finally felt the sun's warmth on their wan faces. Site 508. The workhouses and shelters, which had been bursting at the seams, began to empty out as the weather improved. Site 509. The daily terror of freezing to death recedes, replaced by the less immediate, though still pressing, anxieties of finding food and work in a city slowly coming back to life. In the wealthier districts, the melt signals a return to social normalcy. The great houses of Mayfair and Belgravia would once again throw open their doors for lavish balls and soirees, their crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow on the fashionable throng below. The season can finally begin in earnest. For businesses, too, it's a mixed blessing. Carlo Gotti, the ice magnate, might find his stocks of precious Norwegian ice that had been so coveted during the freeze would now languish in the holds of ships slowly melting away as the weather turned warmer. Site 531. It's a classic case of supply and demand, with nature suddenly flooding the market with a less exclusive, if rather dirtier, local product. The thaw, however, isn't without its own set of dangers. Falling ice from rooftops can be a serious hazard for unsuspecting pedestrians. Blocked drains and overwhelmed sewers, struggling to cope with the sudden deluge of meltwater, can lead to localized flooding, turning cellars and basements into damp, unhealthy swamps. And as the accumulated filth of winter thaws and mingles with the water, there's an increased risk of disease. It's a good reminder that even a welcome change can bring new challenges. Urban historians debate whether the civic infrastructure of Victorian London, particularly its drainage and sanitation systems, was ever adequately equipped to handle the rapid runoff and waste displacement caused by major thaws. Yet despite the mess and the new minor perils, the overwhelming feeling is one of release. The oppressive weight of the deep freeze lifts. You see more people out and about, their faces, though perhaps still pale and pinched, Site 575, showing a hint of optimism. Slowly but surely, the rhythms of normal life resumed. Site 509. The clatter of hooves and wheels on cobblestones, though perhaps splashing through more puddles than usual, sounds more energetic. The cries of street vendors seem a little less mournful. It's as if the entire city is stretching and yawning after a long, enforced hibernation. The source notes, Londoners couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Site 508. as the perils and privations of winter were finally coming to an end. Site 508. The great snow and ice sculptures, both accidental and deliberate, that had characterized the frozen city now weep and dissolve, returning to their constituent elements. The grand snowball fight in Trafalgar Square, Site 506, is now just a soggy memory. The memory of the frost-bound flotilla with its impromptu parties and shared rations, Site 567, becomes a tale to be told, its icy stage now flowing water once more. The Great Winter had indeed been a test of their mettle, Site 534, but Londoners had, for the most part, endured. As the last of the slush from the Great Thaw of 1895, or any other equally memorable winter, finally drains away, you find that the physical ordeal may be over, but the memory of the freeze lingers, potent and formative. These brutal winters weren't just weather events, they were crucibles that forged stories, shaped art, and left an indelible mark on the Victorian psyche. You begin to hear how these frosted memories are passed down, becoming part of London's enduring folklore. The most immediate way these winters live on is through storytelling. The source material paints a vivid picture of this. In the years to come, old-timers would regale younger generations with tales of the deep snows and great freezes of bygone days, their stories taking on an air of survivor's pride. You can just imagine a grandfather, pipe in hand, by a warm fire, captivating his grandchildren with tales of the massive snowball fight that had erupted in Trafalgar Square, Site 565, making it sound like a Napoleonic battle, but with more slush. Or the bands of intrepid citizens who had taken it upon themselves to clear the streets, armed with shovels and buckets of ash, Site 566, their efforts growing more heroic with each retelling. And, of course, the heartwarming tale to emerge from that great winter, the story of the frost-bound flotilla, where stranded bargemen created an impromptu floating village, Site 567, and shared spirited competitions of skittles played on the frozen canal, Site 567. These weren't just anecdotes, they were legends in the making, a testament to the resilience and spirit of the Victorian people in the face of nature's fury, Site 529. As the source notes, Londoners would tell and retell the stories of that ferocious, unforgettable winter, embellishing the tales a little more with each passing decade, Site 1569. Human nature, it seems, has always enjoyed a good embellishment, especially if it makes surviving a near-glacial apocalypse sound even more impressive. This drive to remember and recount found its way into more formal cultural expressions, too. The Victorian era was a golden age for literature, and its writers certainly didn't shy away from depicting the drama of winter. Charles Dickens, of course, is a master here. His novels, like A Christmas Carol, Site 600, are so rich with atmospheric winter scenes. The swirling London snow, the ghostly chill, the contrast between Scrooge's cold heart and the warmth of festive cheer, that they have almost single-handedly defined our popular image of a Victorian Christmas, and by extension, winter. But he wasn't alone. Many novels and poems paid tribute to the icy times, rendering in vivid verse the exquisite beauties and piercing deprivations of a city gripped by frost, Site 563. Artists, too, were captivated. The source mentions how the memories would be captured in the frosty works of artists like James McNeill Whistler, who found strange beauty in the city's icebound austerity, Site 601, and the haunting engravings of Gustave Doré, who documented London in all its squalor and splendor, including its wintry aspects. Literary critics continue to debate whether the harsh winters in Victorian literature were primarily realistic backdrops used to heighten drama, or if they served as complex symbolic representations of social ills, moral decay, or even psychological states. The impact on the collective psyche of Londoners was profound. There was that survivor's pride, Site 563, you noted earlier, a sense of having weathered the storm and come out stronger. But there was also undoubtedly a lingering respect, perhaps even a fear, for winter's raw power. These weren't abstract historical events. They were lived experiences that shaped how people viewed their environment and their own resilience. Every time a particularly cold wind blew, or the first snowflakes fell, those memories would resurface. You can imagine parents warning their children with a stern, "Now this is nothing like the Great Freeze of '95, let me tell you." Did these experiences lead to lasting change? Perhaps. The sheer scale of suffering during the worst winters undoubtedly fueled the arguments of social reformers calling for better housing, sanitation, and poor relief. The visibility of the poor, their pinched faces blue with cold, Site 547, made their plight harder to ignore, at least temporarily. The source mentions that as the 19th century closed, social reformers were beginning to agitate for change, their calls for better housing and working conditions a harbinger of the thaw to come, Site 598. However, the wheels of social reform turned slowly and often. Once the immediate crisis of a bad winter passed, the urgency faded. It's a bit like our modern resolutions to finally sort out the attic, full of determination in January, conveniently forgotten by March. One rather eccentric cultural offshoot of these memorable winters, as the source highlights, was their immortalization in penny dreadfuls and music hall songs, Site 569-583. Imagine a catchy, if slightly morbid tune about the day the serpentine cracked, or a thrilling, exaggerated tale of hairbreadth escapes from the ice, being belted out to a raucous theater crowd. It's a very Victorian way of processing trauma, turn it into cheap entertainment. Ultimately, these frosted memories became woven into the fabric of London's identity. The legends of those frozen festivities, Site 610, like the frost fairs, even as they receded into the past, would endure, Site to 610. The city's ability to endure any hardship, any trial, and still come up smiling, or at least stoically grumbling, was reinforced by each winter survived. The narrative wasn't just about suffering, it was about resilience, fellowship, and the unquenchable human spirit. Site 568. The winter tales became a reminder that, even in the darkest and coldest of times, there is always light and warmth to be found in the unbreakable bonds of our shared humanity. Site 570. As your journey through the brutal winters of Victorian London draws to a close, you find yourself back in the hopefully warmer and significantly less foggy present, reflecting on the lingering chill of that bygone era. So much has changed. The infamous pea soupers, those noxious winter pea soupers that stung eyes and turned white shirts gray, Site to 470, are largely a thing of the past, thanks in no small part to measures like the Clean Air Act of 1956, which drastically reduced coal smoke. Site 473. The Thames no longer freezes solid with the regularity that allowed for those spectacular frost fairs. Site 483. A combination of a generally warmer climate and changes to the river itself, like the new London Bridge and embankments, put an end to that particular frosty carnival. Yet, the echoes of those harsh seasons still resonate. You can see it in the very fabric of the city if you look closely. Perhaps you spot old coal chutes by basement windows, now bricked up, or elaborate iron boot scrapers by grand doorways, silent witnesses to a time when navigating the muddy, icy streets was a daily battle. These are the small, physical legacies. But the more profound legacy, you realize, lies in the city's spirit and in the societal changes, however slow, that those winters helped to catalyze. The sheer visibility of suffering during those frigid months, the shivering matchgirls and huddled paupers, Site 502, undoubtedly played a role in awakening the social conscience of some Victorians. The source material notes that social reformers were beginning to agitate for change, their calls for better housing and working conditions a harbinger of the thaw to come, Site 598. While it's a long and complex path from Victorian philanthropy to modern social welfare, the undeniable human cost of those winters, laid bare for all to see, surely added impetus to the calls for reform. It's hard to ignore poverty when it's literally freezing on your doorstep. And then there's the lesson in resilience. The grit and perseverance forged over centuries of harsh climes. Site 552, the indomitable resilience of the human spirit in the face of bitter cold, biting hunger and ceaseless dark. Site 556, these aren't just poetic phrases. You've witnessed the almost superhuman endurance of Londoners, their ability to find small comforts and simple joys to light the darkest days. Site 555. This collective memory of hardship overcome, of communities pulling together like the frostbound flotilla, Site 597, surely contributed to a certain toughness, a London spirit that would be tested again in future crises. Historians and sociologists still explore whether the spirit of the Blitz in Waddy Watu's London drew upon a pre-existing cultural resilience forged, in part by centuries of enduring such harsh environmental and social conditions like severe winters. 1. Eccentric but telling legacy might be found in London's enduring love for a cozy pub. In an era of universally drafty homes, the pub, with its roaring fire and convivial atmosphere, was often the warmest and most welcoming place in a neighborhood. It was a refuge, a community center, a place to escape the bone-chilling damp of the docks, Site 517, or the dust-choked cold of the brickyards, Site 517. Perhaps our modern affection for a snug pub corner on a winter's night is a faint, unconscious echo of that deeper, more desperate need for warmth and fellowship. Or maybe we just still like a good pint. Today, a brutal winter in London might mean a few days of transport disruption, complaints about the heating bills, and a desperate search for a decently priced toboggan. We are, thankfully, insulated from the worst of what you've witnessed by warm homes and the easy comforts that we so often take for granted. Site 513. Central heating, thermal clothing, advanced weather forecasting, readily available food, and healthcare systems, however imperfect, create a buffer that the Victorians could only dream of. You no longer have to worry about your ink freezing, Site 548, or an elephant parading down your main waterway because it's too cold for boats, Site 481. The most enduring lesson, perhaps, is one of perspective. To understand the sheer grinding hardship that was a Victorian winter for so many is to gain a profound appreciation for the progress made. It's also to recognize that the London winter may be brutal, but the London spirit is unbreakable. Site 607, an eternal flame that no amount of ice can extinguish. Site 607. That spirit of endurance, of finding humor in adversity, like street hawkers peddling snowballs for the million at a penny a pop. Site 523, and of extending a hand to those in need, is a legacy worth cherishing. The challenges change, the fogs lift, but the need for resilience, compassion, and a good warm coat remains timeless. As you leave Victorian London, the scent of coal smoke fading, the ghostly chill receding, you carry with you not just images of hardship, but of an extraordinary human capacity to adapt, to endure, and to find warmth in the coldest of times. Their story, etched in frost and soot, becomes a part of your own understanding of what it means to weather the storms of life. The cool night air settles around you now, a gentle caress compared to the biting winds of the London you've just left behind. The faint hum of your fan, perhaps, or the quiet rhythm of your own breathing, replaces the imagined sounds of creaking ice and distant cries. You are safe and warm, far removed from the daily struggle for survival that defined those harsh Victorian winters. Let your mind gently release the images of soot-stained snow and shivering figures. Allow the tension to leave your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. Feel the comfort of your own bed, the softness of your pillow, the steady warmth that cocoons you. The people of that past London, with their incredible fortitude, faced their nights with a courage born of necessity. But your night is one of chosen rest, of peaceful descent into slumber. There are no icy drafts here, no gnawing hunger, no chorus of coughs from a crowded room. Only a quiet stillness, a gentle invitation to let go. The great city of the past, with all its frozen grandeur and its deep human suffering, now fades into the soft mists of history, a story told. And as you drift, imagine instead a single, perfect snowflake, intricate and beautiful, landing softly, silently, and then, just as gently, melting away into the quiet dark. Sleep now, peacefully and deeply.